Ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to this book launch. Good afternoon, Professor Jayakumar, and of course, Mr. Wong Kang Seng, and all the other people sitting on the front row. Too many. That is about one page. So, in the interest of time, no have to say all their names, right? Anyway, what happened in March this year was a very expensive coffee chat with Tan Lian Chu. She told me, let's have coffee and talk about something that she's doing for Bilahari. So I agreed. I didn't pay for coffee. Did I pay for coffee? Anyway, even if I pay for coffee, it was not very expensive until she told me that I have to do this. And the offer from Straits Times Press, where is the Straits Times Press? Was that supposed to be a joint venture, but in the end, this joint venture is not a joint venture, it's overwhelmingly credited to RSIS, both in terms of name and in terms of cost. So my team at the RSIS keep reminding me that I cannot do any more charity, especially for a rich company like SPH. Okay. Today, this book is several months of hard work by Lian Chu and Bilahari. We are very happy to be part of this adventure. Yeah. It is an adventure because somewhere along the way, we had to decide on the book cover, and somewhere along the way, we had to decide on what's the proceeding, how to do this and that. And many of my younger colleagues in RSIS have never dealt with Bilahari before. So that is another good training program. Thank you, Bilahari. Yeah. The book has many different chapters. It's a compilation of many of the excellent speeches written by Bilahari. Some of them are not very flattery to some of us because he was always hard-hitting. Yeah, but I think we have edited all those things that are unfavorable to RSIS. So we should be okay. But the rest of you, when you buy it, please look through carefully, and in the next 2 hours, you have a chance to write to him or tell him that he's wrong about you. Beyond this book launch, everything is cast in stone, yeah? The book has been divided into 4 parts with a conclusion, and Tan Lian Chu has worked very hard to get all this organized. I will leave it to her to describe in gory detail some of the elements. Yeah. But we are very happy to be able to invite Professor S. Jayakumar to be our guest of honor this afternoon. I don't know whether he's a fan of Bilahari, but he was our boss lah. So today is what do you call it? The box is open for confession. Yeah, but I don't know what Bilahari will say later. We are happy that Professor Jayakumar can spend time with us, and we are also very happy that another one of our bosses, Mr. Wong Kang Seng, is able to join us this afternoon. So I think you have known Professor Jayakumar very well. I was his student in law school, yeah, and it was quite difficult to pass his paper, but somehow he managed to give me a pass. Nothing to do with CBA, you know, it's just a pass. Then we were very happy when he went to join politics, and we were spared the agony of wondering what is between A, B, C, and pass, you know. So when I joined the Foreign Ministry, I did not think that he would end up in the big office as Minister for Foreign Affairs, so I really cannot escape him. That's my destiny, I suppose. Okay. But we also have a panel of very interesting people. Apart from Bilahari, we have Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, and Chang Heng Chi. I will try my best to keep these 3 people within the time they are allocated as a chairman or moderator. But I think that's about all I will say for now. Once again, welcome to this boat launch. It's actually a celebration of Bilahari's accomplishment, or one of his many accomplishments. And I think you will enjoy the rest of the afternoon. So thank you for joining us, and welcome very much to this boat launch.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was told that the audience today is actually oversubscribed, and that is a testimony to Bilahari and the friendship and esteem in which he's held. And it gives me great pleasure to be here on the occasion of the launch of his book, which is really about foreign policy. Now, all Singaporeans should really be interested in foreign policy, and foreign policy in Singapore's national interests and relationship with foreign policy should be in the consciousness of all Singaporeans. But as with so many other countries, the general public, whether young or old, have so many things in their daily lives to preoccupy them that foreign policy does not figure high in their scheme of things. So those who have knowledge about foreign policy have traditionally been the professionals, academics, journalists, and so on, which is really too narrow a base. But with a fast change of pace, Singaporeans have become more aware of news-breaking events taking place in the region and elsewhere. So I think that this makes it even more important that Singapore become aware of the parameters in which a small, multiracial country like Singapore has to operate on the regional and international plane. Otherwise, we would become susceptible to external influences that really do not have the interests, the best interests of Singapore at heart. Some Singaporeans are more vocal and quicker than other Singaporeans to express the views or concerns. And this can be seen especially in social media, platforms where many Singaporeans and residents here have expressed their views. But really, being vocal does not necessarily mean the same thing as being informed. And this sometimes creates dilemmas for decision makers. Not only must we be aware of the national interests which lie at the heart of our foreign policy, but we must also not be blind to the fact that other countries will mount, and actually have mounted, rather clever and cunning tactics using social media to influence various segments of our people to either swing to their side or to be critical of our own foreign policy stance. But this is all part of the big power game. So therefore, I find it apt that the title of Bilahari's book is Singapore is Not an Island. And that is typical Bilahari, as you know. Every school student knows that Singapore is an island geographically, surrounded by the sea. But anyone who knows Singapore well will know that our success could not have been predicated on being an idyllic tropical island in the Pacific or Asia Pacific, as the illustration on the cover of Bilahari's book seems to depict. Our future depends on how well we understand and manage our connectedness to the rest of the region and the rest of the world. Our past success depended very much on how we achieve this by balancing and bearing in mind our mutual interests with other countries that we have built good relations with. Now, this also means that what affects the countries that we are close to will also affect us. We cannot live and prosper without constantly being aware of the implications of developments around us. And during my time as foreign minister, foreign policy issues were not major domestic issues, and political parties, opposition parties, generally did not take issue with government's foreign policy decisions. More recently, however, there has been a worrying trend of groups that aspire to prescribe alternative foreign policies when they only have a superficial understanding of how the world really works. Singapore's vulnerabilities have been dismissed or downplayed by such groups. Moreover, as Bilahari points out in his book, there are the first signs of failure by some to resist the temptation to use foreign policy as a tool of partisan politics. There will always arise episodes which will test us as a people. For example, the Haze and the Indonesian response, developments in the Middle East, radicalization of Muslims in Southeast Asia. And when such episodes arise, I think it's important that we as a people do not react in a knee-jerk way, but rather in an informed way based on our national interests. A good understanding of our foreign policy by Singaporeans, I think, will add to our national resilience, and it will also give us the common instincts to act always as one people when faced with such challenges. I agree with Bilahari when he puts it that in the long run, a successful foreign policy must rest on a stable foundation of common understandings of what is and what is not possible for a small country in Southeast Asia. It is important that Singaporeans become more and more familiar with the fundamentals of our foreign policy and what constitutes our national interests, especially when the international landscape is changing so fast. While old problems persist, new challenges will continue to confront the region. For example, South China Sea territorial disputes do have the potential to threaten regional stability, and while Singapore is not a claimant state, we have to position ourselves to safeguard our interests in the freedom of navigation in international sea lanes. Events in the world are never predictable, and we must always expect the unexpected. When surprising or important developments take place, whether the election of President Trump, Brexit, the situation in Qatar, the siege of Marawi in the Philippines, and so on, we should always ask ourselves equally important questions, especially what these portend for Singapore. Then again, how do we deal with bigger powers who have a penchant for pressurizing or bullying smaller countries? In one of my books, I gave an example of an ASEAN regional forum, which I chaired as foreign minister, where both the United States and China, for quite separate reasons, tried to bully and pressurize us. On that occasion, I distinctly remember Bilahari worked with me closely on that issue to ensure that we came across as standing firm, principled, but yet reasonable. Of course, how long can Singapore continue to take such an independent and principled position with big powers? We should not go out of our way to provoke or annoy them, but they need to understand that at all times we act in our interests and in no one else's interests. So I'm very pleased to launch this book, which is a collection of essays and public speeches by Bilahari. As I've said in the cover of the book, as foreign minister, I worked with Bilahari, and I found him to be one of the finest minds in the Singapore public service. And I think it was very fortunate for MFA and our foreign service that he chose to devote his adult life to the cause of Singapore's diplomacy and the work of MFA. Publication of this readable collection can help many more Singaporeans, especially the younger ones, to have insights into Singapore's foreign policy, to know why it was conducted in this way, why it has been in these past years, what are the challenges ahead of us, what are the changes we should make, and how generally our foreign policy should be approached for the present and for the future. I wish to congratulate Bilahari for an outstanding book, and I hope it is read as widely as it needs. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, let me say a big thank you to everyone for being here today. I also wish to express my special thanks to the many distinguished guests who have made time to join us here, and in particular, Professor Jayakumar for addressing us as the guest of honor. My thanks also go to RSIS for organizing this event, and to the Straits Times Press for wanting to publish this book. In particular, Susan Long, Eunice Kwek, Ilan Goh. Thank you. But of course, we would not be here today if the author himself, Bilahari Kausikan, had not consented in the first place to have his writings and speeches compiled into this book. So I would like to place on record here my thanks to Bilahari for agreeing to this endeavor. Some of you may wonder why I undertook this editing project, since Bilahari's writings, except for the epilogue in the book, have been reproduced one form or another in the Straits Times or elsewhere, including in his much-followed Facebook page. People say that young people today don't like to read books. Certainly, I do not expect many of them will want to read a book on Singapore foreign policy from cover to cover. But it is my conviction that young Singaporeans do want to be better informed, and I believe that this can be facilitated by their having a ready access to insights with bite-sized, standalone essays put in a framework for better understanding of our past and present foreign policy concerns and interests. I have therefore put this collection together with the hope that our young can be better engaged, and in the process, we may, as Singaporeans, forge a common understanding of what is and what is not possible for a small, multiracial country like Singapore in Southeast Asia. Now, I must be the only one in this room who has read every line in this book at least half a dozen times, each time with a different purpose, I should add. But I can honestly say that I would not mind reading these essays again. Those of us who have known and worked closely with Bilahari know how he thinks, how fast he works, and how impatient he can be. His public speeches and writings reflect this. But what is often forgotten by the occasional listener or reader is that Bilahari has been reiterating consistently the fundamentals upon which all our recent policies have been based or must necessarily be based on. And these appear as recurring themes in the book. Bilahari is very widely read and has a wonderful facility with the English language. So much so, his candid reiterations, impatient or otherwise, often come across with clarity and wit, even as they are thought-provoking and profound. So I can do no better here than to pluck a few of his statements from this book to illustrate what I mean. Quote number 1, open quotes. "The bedrock of relevance is success. I have always told our foreign service officers that if Singapore's foreign policy has been successful, it is not because of their good looks, natural charm, or the genius of their intellect. The most brilliant idea of a small country can be safely disregarded if inconvenient, whereas the most stupid idea of a large country must be taken seriously. In fact," and I'm still quoting Bilahari, "the more stupid the idea, the more seriously it must be taken because of the harm a large country can do. If we succeed, it is only because Singapore as a country is successful. Singapore's success invests our ideas and actions with credibility. Quote number 2. Consider what sovereignty means to Singapore by deconstructing a single sentence. Singapore is a small state located in Southeast Asia. This seems straightforward, but is it really? What do we mean by small? We are, of course, a physically small country. A moderately athletic person could, without too much difficulty, walk across it in a day. But as a trading center, as a logistics hub, as a port and airport, and as a financial center, among others, we loom quite large internationally, far larger than our physical size may lead one to expect. Quote number 3. Size, physical size, matters, and small states are intrinsically irrelevant to the workings of the international system. It is impossible to conceive a world without large countries such as the United States, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, or Russia, or even without medium-sized states such as Australia, Japan, France, or Germany. But the world will probably get along fine without Singapore as a sovereign and independent country. After all, it has only had to put up with us for some 50 years. For small states, relevance is not something to be taken for granted. The creation and maintenance of relevance must be the overarching strategic objective of small states. Quote number 4. We have to take the world, or even that little part of it we call Southeast Asia, as it is, and not mistake our hopes and wishes for reality. This does not mean that we should not be aspiring to change things in accordance with our ideals, but such an effort is doomed to failure unless it starts from an unsentimental understanding of reality. Quote number 5 on the rise of China. By changing itself, China changed the world, and many Western countries are now struggling to come to terms with what China's re-emergence implies for their own histories and sense of identity. And quote number 6, this is the last. Policy options for a small city-state are narrow, as are margins for error. History teaches us that city-states are particularly vulnerable to rapid, technologically different changes in the structure of the global economy, such as those the world is now experiencing. There are no easy or perfect solutions. What is necessary will not necessarily be popular. To continually adapt and survive, trust between the government and people must be maintained. This requires all citizens to be aware of the unique possibilities and limitations of a city-state and the confidence to remain ourselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, without much further ado, allow me to pass the floor to Bilahari Kausikan himself to make his comments. Thank you.
Professor Jayakumar, Mr. Wong Kan Seng, Keng Yong, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. All but 3 of the pieces in this volume were written after I retired. When the Straits Times Press first approached me to collect and publish them, I was reluctant. They were occasional pieces written in response to specific events now past. I did not think there was much value in preserving the ramblings of a pensioner. It's only when my friend Tan Yen Chu persuaded me that there was some utility in doing so, and perhaps recklessly agreed to take on the onerous task of editing them, that I agreed. And I am grateful for her efforts. I am also grateful to Professor Jayakumar for agreeing to be guest honor and for the kind words he addressed to me, and to Mr. Wong Kan Seng for attending this book launch, as I am grateful to all of you for being here. I thank all of you. The world is in face of more than usual uncertainty and unpredictability, and has been for some time. It is crucial that Singaporeans try to understand events dispassionately and with reference to our own national interests. We should not uncritically accept judgments which may be based on entirely different considerations. And this is particularly so when we consider the new American administration. What happens in the United States has a profound influence on our region and the world. It is essential that we understand developments in that country, and indeed in every country, clinically and independently. In March this year, I visited Washington, D.C. and spoke to many old friends, mainly Asian experts of both parties. Few had anything good to say about the Trump administration. And if you read the American media, you will get the impression that everything the new president has done is wrong. From the way he chooses to eat steak, which the Washington Post lampooned, to his reaffirmation of the One China policy, which the New York Times somewhat strangely depicted as weakness and a retreat. And the European media and foreign policy experts have adopted similar attitudes. Now, this is dangerous exaggeration. Uncritical criticism can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, I do not mean to suggest that everything is honey and roses. Certainly, the cancellation of the TPP was a serious blow to American credibility, as was the disavowal of the Paris Agreement on climate change. The possible direction of American trade policy is deeply troubling, as is the perception that the administration may be Islamophobic. But it is factually incorrect to suggest that nothing Mr. Trump's administration has done is right. Some of the criticism and mockery is downright irrelevant. So Mr. Trump chooses to eat his steak well done and with ketchup, instead of, say, medium rare and with sauce béarnaise. So what? And why was it wrong to reaffirm a policy, the One China policy, that has stood since 1972? We should not let Mr. Trump's flamboyant personality and penchant for apparently spontaneous pronouncements get in the way of analysis. What the president tweets is good copy. What his administration does is more important. And in East Asia, the Trump administration's foreign and security policies have been within the general historical norm. This should not be surprising, since the range of realistic options is not overly broad. And some aspects are improvements over previous policies. I've already referred to the reaffirmation of the One China policy. The administration has also reaffirmed the importance of American alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. When he visited Indonesia earlier this year, Vice President Pence announced that President Trump would attend the forthcoming APEC, East Asia, and ASEAN-US summits. The Seventh Fleet has not stopped operating in the South and East China Seas, and recently conducted a FONOC, a Freedom of Navigation operation, in the South China Sea with the promise of more to come. And it is not as if everything previous administrations did was correct. For example, the Obama administration's policy of so-called strategic patience towards North Korea, a euphemism for doing almost nothing, was a serious mistake which gave Pyongyang 8 years to develop its nuclear and missile capabilities. It was correct for the Trump administration to have deployed carrier strike groups to and near Korean waters in response to North Korean missile tests. Now, I do not think North Korea can be dissuaded from proceeding with its missile and nuclear programs. Sooner or later, North Korea will have nuclear-capable ICBMs that can reach the continental United States. But the Trump administration can hardly be held responsible for this. We are on the cusp of major strategic change in the Northeast Asian security environment. All the more important, therefore, to demonstrate resolve now through a show of overwhelming force, so as to maintain deterrence in the not-too-distant future. And the other examples are serious mistakes by previous administrations, both Democrat and Republican. There are other instances where the Trump administration's approach has, I think, been an improvement. It was a brilliant stroke to have launched an attack on Syria while at table with President Xi Jinping. It did much to ameliorate the impression of weakness and indecision when President Obama drew a red line over Syria's use of chemical weapons, but failed to enforce it. Now, the attacks of the Western media and foreign policy establishments on the Trump administration are often, I think, driven by their inability or unwillingness to come to terms with Mr. Trump's election. Some of it reflects political agendas of one sort or another. Such motivations may be understandable, but are none of our business in Singapore. Whatever we may think of their policies, Singapore must work with any American administration, just as we must work with any Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Russian, Indonesian, Thai, or for that matter, if the need arises, Ethiopian government. We have to take the world as it is, irrespective of whether or not it suits our preferences or convenience. But the herd instinct is strong among the scribbling and chattering classes, and I think some of our own has succumbed to it. A fashionable trope is that the Trump administration's abdication of leadership rebounds to China's advantage. This is an oversimplification. I do not think the Trump administration has forsworn leadership, although it has a different definition of leadership. Insofar that there is a deficit of global leadership, Mr. Trump's election was symptom, not a cause, as was the election of Mr. Obama before him. The current global order was fraying at its edges well before Mr. Trump was elected. I do not think China can easily fill a deficit of global leadership. And no matter what they may say, I think Chinese leaders know this. In January this year at Davos, President Xi Jinping delivered an eloquent defense of globalization. This was regarded as demonstrating China's confidence and willingness to lead in place of America. But President Xi's defense of globalization could also be read as a tacit admission that there is no alternative to the current American design and led world order, and concern over what it might mean for China should that order further unravel. President Xi's One Belt, One Road is a bold and ambitious vision of great potential, well worth supporting. But it is still largely only just that, a vision and not yet a reality. One Belt, One Road rests on the foundation of the current global order, as does China's continued growth. It is not a substitute for the current global order. Can One Belt, One Road succeed if the current open, interconnected global order crumbles and the world descends into protectionism? To lead an open global order, one must oneself be open. The Chinese Communist Party is ambivalent over further opening and reform because it is unsure what the effect on its rule may be. So far, the party's emphasis has been on tightening central control. And it is not as if China is without serious internal challenges of its own. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hold no brief for any country except our own, Singapore. It is not my intention to defend the Trump administration any more than it is my intention to criticize the Trump administration or any other government. The Trump administration is only 6 months old and events may well prove me wrong. But rushing to judgment based on uncritical acceptance of other people's assessments made for reasons that are irrelevant to Singapore may lead to wrong policy choices. This could trap us in path dependencies that will be difficult to escape. Singaporeans need to understand that the manipulation of public opinion by various means, covert and overt, has been a tool of statecraft since time immemorial. The purpose is to pressure governments to change policies. Hence the need for clear, balanced, and independent judgments. And that is my essential point, which the pieces collected in this book are intended, however imperfectly, to illustrate. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me.
Good evening. Professor Jayakumar, Mr. Wong Kan Sing, distinguished guests. I didn't know how this would be formatted, so I wrote a commentary. I said to King Yong, what should I do? He said, you can give it. I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Or perhaps I have come to praise Caesar, not to bury him. Bilahari will appreciate my opening statement because his introduction, the first 33 pages of the book, is written in a mannered, philosophical, and erudite style, showing he's having quite a chuckle at someone else's expense. This book is a collection of speeches and writings that the author has given over the years. Now he tells me not. 3 are, most were written afterwards. But it certainly explains the thinking of Singapore's foreign policy very well. Bilahari shows a good insight into the dynamics and issues of regional politics and the world issues he selects to comment on, often with a refreshing perspective. As Giorgio, a former foreign minister, said, you may not always agree with Bilahari, but you cannot dismiss his views lightly. He's one of the best minds the Foreign Service has produced. In fact, when I was in Washington, I used to tell people, Bilahari Kausikan, he's the resident genius of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The strength of the essays is in the sharpness he brings to tackling the fundamental existential questions of Singapore and the frankness with which he addresses its dilemmas. I would, however, argue that not all Singapore diplomats practice foreign policy with the same degree of cynicism articulated by Bilahari. I know in one of the first essays, Bilahari urges young people to look at uncertainty with a pragmatic skepticism, not cynicism. I agree. But when you are too skeptical, you become an ideological skeptic. Then the line between the skeptic and the cynic disappears. The point is, when one is too skeptical or cynical, one can miss opportunities in diplomacy and foreign policy, in business and in life. Realism, yes. Skepticism, yes. Cynicism sometimes. Some even cherish idealism. You must know how to channel the idealism. I will begin by expanding on the inescapable truths that shape Singapore's foreign policy, which the book underscores. This is what Bilahari defines, and I'm just expanding on the ideas. Foreign policy begins with working the reality and origins of independent Singapore, a Chinese majority state in Southeast Asia, in the Malay archipelago. We were born of conflict in a region of war, separation, confrontation, and the Vietnam War. For survival in the region, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the first generation of leaders picked policies deliberately to ensure we would not be seen as a third China. We would be a lightning rod for attack. 50 years on, we are in the same location, and the realities have not changed. Ethnicity remains an issue in Malaysia and Indonesia, and it is resurgent in the world. Ethnicity never disappears. It can be dormant, it can wax, and becomes salient when triggered. Ethnic politics is ugly, religious politics is dangerous, and there is always the possibility of contagious influence. Singapore has built a multiracial, multireligious, multicultural, and multilingual society. The multiracialism is what distinguishes Singapore from other countries. To persuade 3/4 of the population of one ethnic group, majority Chinese, to give up its claims to majoritarianism and accept multiculturalism and multilingualism because Singapore is located in Southeast Asia was an act of political genius. It was not a multiculturalism that just tolerates other ethnic groups, but that each group is accorded equal recognition and status. And there is a conscious policy to integrate the different races and ethnicity. Singapore's foreign policy was and still remains one of protecting its sovereignty and identity as a small state and a multiracial state. They are goals we cannot take for granted. We have seen so far at least 3 spectacular examples in recent memory: Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and more recently, the severance of ties with and blockades against Qatar by 7 countries in the Middle East. The nature of our state is something we have to keep explaining to others, including China, where at some levels we are sometimes referred to as the Chinese country. This is what Bilahari points out. And with the increasing influence of Chinese soft power and economic hard power, Singapore will, through its policies, seek to emphasize the Singaporeanness of our identity and sovereignty. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew made a point of it in the early days of nationhood. 50 years on, we are still making a point of it because of rising China. It is not evidence of unfriendliness. It is simply a reaffirmation of a national identity that is still in the making and of our distinctiveness. Shall I go on? I still have some more.
Please.
What
I
are
can stop you.
True. What are the fundamentals of our foreign policy? Singapore's foreign policy is one based on principles, is pragmatic and consistent. We must base our foreign policy on principles. This is obvious. We need principles to guide us as we make our way through the complex and sometimes treacherous world of international politics. Our foreign policy is based on the principles of the UN Charter, international law and norms, UNCLOS, rules of WTO, and the rule of law. It is especially pertinent for small states. We have a sense of what we must do to survive and to protect ourselves. I believe our foreign policy must be guided by a set of principles, but we should not highlight it in every speech to say we have a principled foreign policy. Principled foreign policy. There is no need to. We can make the point now and again, but it is for others to see our policies and actions and conclude we have a principled foreign policy. Our foreign policy should be based on principles, but we should not be ideological about it. Similarly with consistency. We should not keep repeating we have a consistent foreign policy. I agree with Bilahari when he said in his essay, Seeking Security Through Diplomacy, I quote, "Consistency is only possible at such a high level of generality that it is practically useless. A foolish consistency can in fact be harmful." We are also realists. There would be times when a country would have to weigh its strategic interests against its principles or values. In the United States, we know there are realists who see strategic interests as more important than values in some situations in their foreign policy. All US presidents have to deal with the question of what emphasis they should place on human rights and to what extent they would do business with authoritarian regimes. When it is in the strategic interest of the US to work with a country that has a poor human rights record, they can and they have conveniently overlooked it. They are acting as realists. To be realist in the Singapore context is to have a clear thinking of what is unfolding, not as we wish it to be, as Bilahari often says, but as it is. Not to overread and not to underestimate, and then to take the appropriate action. Our foreign policy over the last 50 years has served us well. We became independent during the Cold War era. We chose to be non-aligned, but pro-West. In the post-Cold War period, like many countries, we had to adjust to the US hegemonic moment and to the Western triumphalist push for democracy and human rights. You will recall our attempts to push back with Asian values. We welcomed the US security presence and economic presence, but saw the promotion of democracy as a new cultural imperialism. We worked through ASEAN and other countries in the region to ensure that the US stayed in the region and that an emerging China would be integrated into the regional institutions, and importantly, that the United States and China would be able to engage with each other in one forum. I believe everyone in the region, including Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, thought this would be a good strategic move and a necessary one. But in the last 2 decades, the world has dramatically changed. When I arrived in Washington in 1996, the United States was enjoying its unipolar moment, and Americans were full of confidence. I remember I sat in on a futures exercise on the eve of the millennium, run by the Department of Defense think tank, and there was a handful of foreigners. We were asked, what were the certainties of the 21st century? And we had to type in the answer, a line or two, anonymous, of course. It comes out on the screen. And you can type in as many lines as you like. Many, I presume, Americans typed. The US will remain the hegemonic power in the 21st century. America will remain the superpower. And others said technology will be king, and a few statements on science, climate change, and the environment. I waited. There was nothing on China. I typed. China will emerge as a great power in the 21st century. There were a couple of other statements reflecting this thought at about the time I was typing too, but not many, 2 or 3. By the time I left the United States in 2012, at the end of my tour, the United States had changed from a confident power to one of self-doubt. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and America plunged into a deep recession. There were so many books published on declinism in the US. I never bought into that thesis. The US is a far more resilient power that is highly creative. There have also been many periods in history when the US was down and ended rebounding. The US is resilient, as we all know. Well, today, the US economy has recovered some. The stock market has done exceedingly well, maybe fully because of the Trump effect, and the dollar is strong against other currencies. China has emerged as a formidable economic power and is the second largest economy in the world. But it has its share of internal difficulties. Still, its trajectory in the long run is up. The election of Donald Trump as President of the United States has infused greater unpredictability about the US commitment to global leadership. Bilahari has reiterated that we should look at the facts, not at the rhetoric. I believe we are seeing the beginning of the post-America world. I am not saying the US will not remain a superpower. It will. It is still the predominant power globally. But it seems no longer interested in leading the world as it once did in the 20th century and in the first decade of the 21st century. President Obama believed in leading from behind, and the Syrian Red Line showed to be no line at all. President Trump has asserted America first as a guiding principle of his policies, rejected globalization, TPP, and the Paris Agreement, and has belatedly recommitted the US to Article 5 of the NATO agreement. What is concerning is, as a recent book, No is Not Enough, on the new right-wing populism. I read it in Gillian Tett's review in this weekend, Financial Times. This book pointed out, we can make sense of the Trump phenomenon if we see him as a culmination of much bigger social and economic trends, and that he reflects bigger cultural and social dynamics. This means America as a society is changing in what it wants for itself. It does not mean turning its back to the world, but that it is more selective in its interventions on the international scene. And Chancellor Merkel, after the NATO meeting, said her famous one line, "The times when we could rely fully on others, they are somewhat over." And it was supposed to indicate a major strategic shift. I come to the end. Now, recently, in his latest IPS lecture, 2017, Peter Ho spoke of the great disruption that we are witnessing before our eyes. The rapid advancement in technology, the change in how economies operate, people are changing and reinventing themselves, and borders are breaking down. I buy into that thesis. What this means is that countries must be agile and nimble to deal with the changing world. It may be necessary for us in this new world to review and to re-examine how we go forward and rethink the sets of relationships that we have. So the question is how we apply our principles in the new world, and do we need to even re-examine some of the principles? Thank you.
Professor Jayakumar, Mr. Wong Kan Seng, our resident genius author, Mr. Bilahari, and of course, the chairman, moderator, Mr. Ong Keng Yong. I'm indeed delighted to be here and a little surprised because in this august number of speakers, somebody with a little bit of a different texture from the private sector would be a little bit more difficult to accommodate. But I'm glad I'm here, and I want to congratulate Bilahari for what he has done. I've been given 10 minutes to speak. What I'm going to do is divide that into 3 sections. The first one would be a little bit about the author.
Oh dear.
He knew it was coming. Second is about the book. And third is a general view of the foreign policy. Now, this is a difficult area because in the presence of 2 former ministers, in the presence of a number of very senior civil servants connected with the MFA, if you say something, you need to be very careful. But as the longest serving daily rated employee of MFA, I think I can afford to take a little bit of risk and tempt fate. So that's what I'm going to do. So first about Bilahari, my friend. I heard of him even long before I joined as a non-resident ambassador into MFA. I was struck by his name, Bilahari, and I felt that the man who gave him that name, his father, is a man to be well considered, well respected, because he's a man of culture and deep knowledge of Indian classics. Whether the name suits the person, that's not something I'm going to go into. But what I wanted to say was, it was such a beautiful name. It is a rag or raga of Carnatic music. It's a melody. And that's why I said whether it suits him or not, I don't know. But and this, the father must have had some expectation that the son will grow to understand and sort of get a deep meaning of this music. So you have one more disappointed father in heaven now. Several months after I became an NRA, one day I get a post, a mail, by post. I opened it up, I found that it was an article by Bilahari on the foreign service, on foreign policy of Singapore. I had been getting information from the Directorate 4 until then, telling me various things. I was covering Iran. I never had very much from the Directorate, which I already didn't know from the newspapers. So I didn't have a very high opinion. In fact, at one time I went to see the director and say, can we discuss Middle East? And he said, sorry, I know very little about Middle East. My deputy would be the one who you should talk to. And that happened to be a pretty girl, and I enjoyed that meeting. But Bilahari's note was such an excellent piece of work. I was very impressed. So I quickly wrote him a letter of compliment, to compliment him. But true to form, I never got an acknowledgement. So I assumed that he may not have read it, or he said, these guys all do these things. The next episode I had with him was not that favorable. Bilahari, when he wrote the note, he was our ambassador to Soviet Union. I asked a few other people of my group whether they all received it. Most of them said no. So I thought maybe he decided that I was the one who needed education, and therefore he sent it to me. But anyway, he gave us a briefing after he came back, not on Soviet Union, but on foreign policy. And my takeaway from that was that he felt, or he was of the view, that there are a few very important countries in the world. They were the important drivers of things, and therefore you must always study them, watch them, react to them, and so on. The others didn't matter. So I said I disagreed with that view. Of course, he was dismissive of dissent. But I was very impressed by the fact that he articulated his ideas very coherently and very deeply thought out answers. He was sometimes, I think, Enchi used the term candid. I used the term blunt. He was blunt and sometimes a little indiscreet. So I left the meeting with an impression that this was probably one of those undiplomatic diplomats. So that's how the meeting ended. But subsequently, I had the chance to travel with him several places and so on. I always was very impressed by his analysis of events, analysis of statements made by, and so on. So that's all about the author. Let me now go on to the book. I take three things out of the book, and I commend, because there are a number of essays. And some of the things I say may not be fair, because these are essays written under different circumstances, as he said. But I think I had to say. The first one, where I totally agreed with what he said, was about Malaysia. The book highlights the changing position of Malays and the concept of Malay supremacy. Bilahari rightly questions the position of the minority races, even if they accept the concept of Malay meritocracy, supremacy, sorry. I totally empathize with his view because I was in Malaysia and I experienced this change. I went to work in Malaysia when Singapore was part of Malaysia. I worked for a government organization called Malaysian Industrial Finance Berhad. Within 1 year of my joining the organization, Singapore was kicked out. Singapore was out of the alliance, or the Malaysia, out of Malaysia. But I saw no change. I continued to work. The racial equation was balanced. There's no problem. I enjoyed the work. I was put in charge of East Malaysia, and I enjoyed it. Then came May 13th, 1969. All of a sudden, everything changed. And they and us syndrome began to surface very, very strong, and especially among the younger people. So my wife and I, we discussed and we decided that we will resign our jobs, sell my house, and go back to Singapore. My wife was Malaysian. She was a teacher in Asunta Secondary School as an English teacher. The news that I'm going to resign went up to my chairman, Tun Ismail, who was also chairman of Bank Negara. So he called me up and he said, "What's all this that you are going to leave?" So I said, "I'm thinking about it." He said, "Don't act in haste." And he said, "Tell me, what are your reasons?" So I told him the complete unease I felt dealing with educated young Malays who saw all the minorities as transient groups, not really people of the soil or people of the country, and therefore they behaved in a different way. This didn't exist before. So I said, I found this very difficult to accept, and I'd rather go and look for a new job, maybe less comfortable than what I had, but I said I'm prepared to take the risk. So he was a little sort of upset by this, and he said, "You are a very." He tried to say that this is just the enthusiasm of the woman, but I said I don't think so. Yeah, but he was a little upset, and he said, "You are a very cynical young man." I was young at that time. The meeting with him confirmed my decision that I'm going to change. So that's the first. The second topic in the book that I would comment on is the rise of China. This has taken, for good reason, more space than any other topic in the book. Singapore needs to handle China very carefully. In the late 50s, as a student, I think Prof. Jayakumar would have known this, that I used to go and listen to Radio Beijing, English broadcasts. It's usually jam. But when you go up to the terrace of the Ngian building in Orchard Road, you get fairly good reception, and you can hear what they say. And I used to hear how they rubbish the Singapore government. They used to call it the Lee Kuan Yew clique, and then talk about the lackeys of the imperialists and so on. But they never were racial. In fact, they tend to be very conciliatory towards the Malays in their various comments. But otherwise, they were totally non-racial. It was a political sort of thing. But today, it's a different thing. I was in China a few weeks ago on another assignment. And the speakers made it very clear that we are conscious of the fact that Singapore is 75% Chinese. The hidden message in this was very clear, and that disturbed me. So I think this is one area I think we need to be very careful. The third point about the book may not be something that you think is very good for me to mention. The commentator's job is to talk about what is in the book. I'm going to just mention what should have been in the book, especially since now he revealed that he wrote some of them after he retired. What does he do? He can write. Two topics I think he needed to have addressed. One is the Middle East. There is in the otherwise good book, very excellent book. I'm not saying this to please him. I don't need to, you know. I'm daily rated, so. But was the absence of a real analysis in his usual incisive way, what goes on in Middle East. I saw Mr. Dorsey going. He's one of those who picks his brains on analysis of Middle East. This is a big omission. The second, I felt, was Indo-China relations. The two largest countries in the world, two largest countries in Asia, they are moving towards a situation where the relationship is going to get worse, not better. This is my view. I may be totally wrong. I hope I'm totally wrong. But I feel the actual problem will arise in probably 7-8 years when Dalai Lama names his successor. And if that successor happens to be in Indian territory, Arunachal Pradesh, Tawang, then I expect all hell to break loose, because the Indians will have to come and support. Indian High Commissioner is here, he may disagree, but India will have to take a strong position that they will respect the decision of the Dalai Lama, and this will upset the Chinese. And I think the relations are going to be. So I think the book would have been enhanced further if these two elements had been incorporated into the book. The final dangerous area that I want to talk about is Singapore's foreign policy. By all the statements that you have heard that have been said, we have been very successful, extremely successful. We are taken seriously, and I agree with him, with Bilahari, that success starts with economic success domestically, and that is good, I think. But there are two areas where I think we probably have not done too well. One, we have not explained our foreign policy. I think Professor Jayakumar mentioned this, not in what I'm saying, but the need for the public to understand the foreign policy. This has not been properly explained. Second, the eagerness with which we cultivate the big powers, the big countries, the people who count. Sometimes in that eagerness, some of the others are missed out, and our knowledge of them are very, very limited. The example on the first one, where we have not explained things properly, is our China policy. We have gone blue in the face explaining to everybody, you know, Tomiko's letter, so many letters that said how close we are to China, how much China has benefited from our, we have trained 5,000 over people, all these things. The Chinese say, okay, let's leave the past. let's come up to date and see what the situation is. This has a great deal of sympathy on the ground in Singapore. And this worries me because they don't understand the rationale. On South China Sea, I think we could have explained it much better in language that is pleasant. I say this with somebody in mind. You know, some people are naturally harsh, so we must get people who can, for want of a better term, sweet talk, but convey the message. Maybe Tommy, you know. Sorry about it, Bilahari. So I think we have not done this. And as a result, our ground, large majority, good people, well-off business community. You can ask Satpal, we are in a lunch group where we get dozens of emails, you know, WhatsApp, saying, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that. Satpal, you agree, you know, to an extent that we find that there's a lack of understanding, and perhaps we could have addressed that. The second point is paying attention to the larger number of countries. I know for a small country it's very difficult, but, and I can quote you like China, the Beijing University of External Studies teaches 81 languages. I'm not saying that we should teach 81 languages, but I'm saying that shows a great power taking the trouble to understand almost every little state on the globe. We can't do that, but we can do better to understand them, because sometimes we take an attitude that we are part of a successful world, and we'll acknowledge you, but so I think we should try to get ourselves accepted, and there are people who want our help. So we should try to not just go by the sort of training programs and so on, but a little bit more. We should be after people who want us rather than together with people who you want. I'm not saying leave China and US away and we do that, but that is the thing. So these are the two probably I see as policy, not policy, the implementation has not been quite good. Maybe I will stop here with one statement. I started with the author, and I will end with the author. Not end him, but end with the author. He said somewhere in the book that he's a pensioner without authority. This reminds me of something that a gentleman, most of you will not remember this name, a man called Mr. Krishna Menon. Mr. Krishna Menon was a member of the Indian cabinet, very close to Pandit Nehru. And, you know, Pandit Nehru protected him. He's a leftist person, and therefore there's a lot of enemies that he had. It was rumored that on the day China, in 1962, when China marched into India, he was having tea with Marshal Chen Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, in Geneva, and they were pally as ever. So the Indian newspapers picked it up and rubbished him, and finally he had to leave the cabinet. Nehru could not protect him. Then some newspaperman went and asked him, aren't you going to miss this loss of power? And he said, whether I'm in the cabinet or I'm running the parliament canteen makes no difference. I'm still the people who come to me want to listen to me, and they will come wherever I am. Now, you are going to hear the melody for a long time. Thank you.